Greetings. This is the lecture on the conflict management processes chapter. I have a lot of opinions about this because we're delving into the realm of the psychological, and the book doesn't always deal with the psychological, so be prepared to hear a lot of my own opinions about this, and also feel free to argue with me, refute them, contradict them, bring in your own experience, because I have my own framework in terms of organizational conflict, which has a lot to do with the eclecticness of my career. So if your experiences are different around it and you've had good experiences with mediation, bring those into the conversation in class or in your reflections or online. Okay, so from the book, conflict is not innately bad. That's the first thing to think about. Conflict can have negative outcomes, it can have positive outcomes. Conflict is uncomfortable for most people, and we tend to think that uncomfortable means bad, or painful means bad. But from a psychological perspective, there's a concept called holding the tension of opposites. I think that's a Jungian thing, Carl Jung, psychologist from the early 20th century. And in his way of looking at it, holding the tension of opposites, living with the idea that you have a certain opinion or standpoint and someone else's is different and that makes you really uncomfortable, sitting with that rather than automatically conceding or going to war psychologically or in your workplace can actually lead to growth. So sitting with the discomfort and considering the other point of view while holding on to your own feelings and not negating them is what that's what holding the tension of opposites is kind of looks like. That's kind of how it's structured. And if you do that enough, you can have some kind of growth where you can see more of the whole rather than yourself and the person or the situation you're having conflict with is on opposite sides. And so when we talked about Maslow and self-realization, there's another term called individuation, which is Carl Jung's term for self-realization or self-actualization, I think is what Maslow calls it. And so individuation is sort of learning to really live in your own skin beyond the social, societal, familial pressures of your life, and being able to welcome in conflicting information while still sort of sitting where you are. It's also a very common concept in Buddhist and yogic, which is early Hindu religion. The idea of sitting with discomfort and sort of getting to know it rather than automatically adapting or running away. So those ideas are hard ideas to put into place in the workplace for some reasons we'll talk about more. So the book talks about phases of organizational conflict, and so I'm going to do a little bit of my own translation of that. So latent is sort of the pre-conflict thing, and to me that's potential conflict. That's the idea that there's something floating around and it may have occurred to you that, oh, that could be bad down the road, but you are not actively stressing out about it yet. Perceived and felt, to me, are sort of just two phases of the same thing. It's just when tension is starting to arise, when I'm feeling tension and anticipation of conflict happening. And so perceived might be one-way tension and felt might be two-way tension, where the other person is also, sort of girding themselves to go to battle over something. So manifest tension is when there is an overt or indirect expression of aggression. So when we talk about conflict, we are talking about aggression most of the time. Conflict where everyone's polite and nice and deals with and works everything out without any stress is not conflict. That's just negotiation. So the book doesn't talk about aggression in this chapter, but that's kind of my specialty. And so to me, the manifest stage is when there are direct or indirect expressions of aggression. So when I talk about direct aggression, that means telling someone to their face that they're wrong, or if you're getting out of control, name calling or physical aggression. That's direct aggression. So if I said, you are wrong, I don't like you, I'm being direct. If I say they're wrong and I don't like them to your best friend, I'm being indirect. There's a lot of permutations of that, but So when you may hear the term relational aggression in other courses or for me, and that's the psychological term for indirect aggression, bullying, gossip, triangulation, which is what I just described, going and telling somebody else that I'm angry at you instead of telling you, especially someone who has a relationship with both of us. That's called triangulation. It's talked a lot about in family psychology, but it happens constantly in the workplace. So anyway, that's where the manifest aggression comes in. And then in the aftermath of aggression, we kind of have two choices. If we deal with the conflict and the aggression that comes up in a open, constructive way, if we sit with the conflict, if we sit with the discomfort and give ourselves time to cool down and negotiate, then there can be transformation. There can be transformation in the process, transformation in the relationship, or transformation in your own psychology, in your own mind. There can also be trauma if it ends badly. Then you don't want to deal with that person, or every time something comes up that reminds you of that situation, you're like, stay away. Or often there's a combination. For me, that's what there is a lot of the time. I was talking last night about a bad interaction I had with a professor, and I handled the situation well, but I do still have some leftover trepidation, which makes it harder for me to ask for feedback from my other professors. And so I have a combination. I did something transformational, I stood up for myself, but I also have trauma. So the reality is that's what's going on most of the time. So figure 9.1 is a little graph of conflict management styles. And the author points out that it's kind of flat. It's not a systems perspective for sure, because you're not looking at what are basically the two axes are concern for self and concern for others. And so if you have high concern for self and high concern for others, you're most likely to collaborate with the other person. If you have low concern for yourself and high concern for others, then you're going to accommodate, you're going to change your position, etc. You can map it out yourself. As the author of the book points out, you can criticize this model by saying, well, you're not looking at culture, and you're not looking at politics, and you're not looking at all this other stuff going on in the systems surrounding the conflict. But to me, that's obvious, right? What I do think is useful is just to look at this idea of concern for self and concern for others and understand that that is a tension that is always present in the workplace. You have met people who are more self-interested than other interested, and you have met people in the workplace who are doormats, and most of us are somewhere in between. We want to further our careers. We've certainly become more individualistic as corporations have become more individualistic, in the sense that you don't have a job for life most of the time anymore. So you don't have this trade-off of giving up some individual agency or power or rights in return for security, financial security through, old age and death, when there were pensions and stuff like that, which don't exist anymore for the most part. And yet, organizations want you to be so sung and show or display constant concern for the organization as a whole, which could be seen as concern for others. When really we're often there, to survive, to make enough money to feed ourselves and our families and pay our rent or our mortgages, and to hopefully build our own careers. And so we are all individually dealing with this tension, which I see as a tension of opposites between our self-interest and the interests of the organization, or the interests of other individuals in the organization. So I think it's a really useful chart for that. No, it doesn't cover every single aspect of the system, but I think that that's a core component of how we operate in the workplace, and can start to explain how conflict happens internally and externally. Okay, going off the map, look at all those words. I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this chapter because my dissertation work is on aggression, and specifically relational aggression, which is indirect aggression, and women and how they express aggression. So I've done a pretty gigantic amount of research on bullying in the workplace, cyberbullying, children and bullying, and then other words for that like aggression, relational aggression. There's all sorts of terms depending on what discipline you're reading from, whether it's psychology or criminology or education. Everybody's got a different word, but we've talked about that. So here's a little insight into my thoughts about aggression and what goes on in the workplace. And if you are interested in this, you can ask me for some of my sources because I have a lot of sources. So to me, conflict is really about certain emotions coming up in the workplace. And I think fear and aggression are those the basic emotions. We fear losing our jobs. We fear being made to look bad. And we have aggression when it comes to protecting our work, protecting our self-image, protecting the perception of our competence in the workplace. Those things are innate. They are innate to being human animals, right? We want to protect what is ours because we want to survive. So fear and aggression are incredibly linked. And aggression usually comes from fear. Now, the book talks a little bit about feminine and masculine attributes. And the author's clearly a feminist because she deconstructs what those are. She says the things that are generally attributed to women and generally attributed to men. And we talked a little bit in class already about how those things are not always what is attributed to men and women doesn't have a whole lot to do with who you are as a man or a woman, as an individual. It's just really big buckets that you may or may not fit in all the time. So feminine attributes like, being collaborative, caring for others, being compassionate, tend to be minimized by organizational culture, which was, as we've talked about, predicated on a very masculine and class-oriented environment when organizational culture became a thing in the 1800s. So we have this assumption that women engage in indirect forms of aggression and men engage in direct forms of aggression. And that is not actually the case. Most of the research that I've looked at shows that by the time we reach adulthood, men and women both prefer indirect aggression because screaming in someone's face or hitting them is just considered inappropriate in the workplace. It still happens. We've talked about that. There are abusive bosses, male or female. I've heard equal stories from both sides. But by the time you're an adult, you are expected to have the self-control not to hit someone in the face or scream at them. And so when aggression comes up in the workplace, it tends to be through making someone look bad, telling someone higher up the chain that they're screwing up, spreading rumors, all the kinds of things that we tend to attribute to politicking are really negative uses of power in the workplace. So the reason why this is important is because psychologically, I believe our work is tied directly to our survival instinct. So when I'm worried about losing my job, I'm worried about losing my house, I'm worried about not being able to send my kid to the school I want to send them to, or pay for their college, or lose my car, or any number of things. Being able to feed myself and my family. Like, that's the main thing that comes up. If I'm worried about losing my job, I'm worried about not being able to eat. Whether or not that's actually the case isn't really relevant. I think that psychologically we associate work with survival. Certainly we see people all the time who are homeless and hungry. And, we know people who have sort of fallen through the cracks in the system. And so we have this, I think we carry as a culture, maybe not every individual, we carry a certain amount of fear with us all the time that is connected directly to work. However, we're not allowed to express fear at work. So I can't come into work one day and say, I'm really terrified I'm going to lose my job, I could use a hug. right? Not so much. Like maybe you can do that with a close friend in the bathroom if you're a chick. But for the most part, I think that we are taught to suppress any feelings of fear or any signs of fear. And I think that tends to inflate aggression. Because if we can't show fear, then we're going to show aggression. And so I think those power dynamics at work, particularly the who has power and who doesn't, regardless of whether or not it's positional power or expert power or, you know, the person who's just the most popular, because sometimes it's like the playground, those can trigger feelings like fear and helplessness, but we're supposed to hide those things. And so that's sort of my whole spiel on conflict in the workplace. Conflict in the workplace to me is more often about repressed fear, which leads to feelings of aggression, than it is necessarily about what's going on. And so it's important, I think, to start to recognize and at least acknowledge to ourselves when we're having feelings of fear. So we then have more choices around how to deal with the situation we're in than to either become aggressive or to hide. Because that's what the survival instinct says. It says either fight or run away. And there's a lot of fighting and running away in the workplace. And I think it's because we can't acknowledge that our work is tied to a deep sense of fear about our own survival. So that's my 2 cents. Something to think about, and we will be able to talk about it more when we look at chapter 11 on emotions, because that chapter talks about emotional intelligence, which is the idea that being able to recognize and express your feelings can really change how you deal with stress in the workplace. Okay, and so the last thing I want to talk about is negotiation and resolution. The book talks about all of this, all of these different models for compromise and concession, and then the ultimate is the win-win. She has a bunch of different terms for this, depending on who the theorist is. But the idea to me, the thing that I have a difficulty with, and I've read books and I've done trainings on conflict resolution and negotiation, and I'm not sure if I totally buy win-win, because maybe it's because I tend to look at things from a systems perspective, but win-win is certainly, I think when people talk about that, what they mean is that you put aside your individual freak out about what's going on and try and find something that works for both parties. But I think you're trying to find something that works for both parties still out of self-interest. It's just a broader sense of self-interest, right? It's not that I have suddenly become a wonderful person and have decided that you deserve, you know, whatever it is that I think I deserve just as much. Maybe that's the case sometimes, but that's generally not a really high conflict situation. I think that win-win is really more about a systems perspective where I take a step back and I go, oh gosh, even if I get all of the cookies and these people get none of the cookies, then there's going to be a bunch of people with no cookies who are really angry and are going to be a constant source of agitation or fear for those of us who got all the cookies, right? It's kind of like, you know, the big social issues about whether or not we, you know, pay into a system that tries to bring everybody up, or it's every man for yourself. And we tend to, in situations of conflict, get to that polarized place very, very quickly. But this this mystical place where everyone puts everything, you know, sort of competitive aside and innovates, and the innovation is a really important part, I think comes from just taking a larger perspective on what it means to win. That recognizing that depriving the other party of what it is they need, or part of what they need, if you're doing that sort of give and take negotiation thing, which is also very necessary sometimes when there are scarce resources that can't be distributed in a way where everyone gets everything they want. But I do think it's about being able to sort of set aside your feelings of fear and anger and territorialness and freakiness and go, okay, what's this going to look like in the long term? If I get everything that I want right now, what is that going to look like 5 years from now? And so for me, win-win is really still negotiation and compromise. It's just at a more systems level. Again, my 2 cents on that. So that's what I've got to say about the conflict chapter, and I will be back soon with chapters 10 and 11.